All right. We're gonna get going right away tonight. I think this is gonna be a little bit longer talk. We'll see. Once we get through the 10 plagues, I might cut it there. I don't know. It depends where we're at. We might try to get through the Red Sea crossing, but it's going to be very difficult, I think. There's a lot packed into the 10 plagues. And I haven't really seen a whole lot of people explain them. I've heard that they're like, well, yeah, I mean, they're attacks on the gods of Egypt, right? And that's usually kind of where it stops. But there's a lot more there than just the attacks on the gods of Egypt to show God's majesty and sovereignty over Egypt, right? So we'll get into it right away. So let's start with a prayer in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we ask you to be with us, to send your Holy Spirit to guide these talks as we begin to unpack the great Exodus, the greatest moment that changed the course of history. This is at our foundation, Lord. Your law that you gave to your people to enlighten them to be different, to be free from bondage and slavery, and free not to do what we want, but free to worship, because from worship comes our identity. We ask all these things through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, as we begin, we break into Exodus. It's very important that you understand something right up front. 400 years have passed. Okay, so from the last talk that we had with Joseph, and Joseph comes down to Egypt, he brings his family down to Egypt, everything's great, Joseph is second in command, all these beautiful things are happening, and then it's just like, cut, and then the next book opens, and it's 400 years later, okay? So this happened, this was a long period of time. When Joseph went down and brought Jacob and his family down to Egypt, at the time, there were only 70 of them, okay? 400 years has passed. There's a lot more of them now, okay? They were very prolific, if that's the right word, right? They had a lot of children. But the problem is that they forgot who they were. You know, they had this identity, and this is what we're going to see in the Exodus, is this hammering. God is hammering this identity into his people. It happens throughout the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers, and it happens all the way through Kings, through the exile, everything, because the greatest enemy to the spiritual life is a short-term memory. I had a spiritual director that said that to me one time. We so quickly forget what God has done for us. The minute a bad thing happens, that's all we focus on. God, where are you? You know, the Lord's got to be like, well, what about, what about all that? You know, like, well, but what about this? We were right. It's happened to us. It's happened to Israel. It happens to every human being. And the greatest rebuke, I've said this in homilies before, the greatest rebuke that God gives in the Old Testament is 2 words. He says it again and again and again. And those 2 words are, you forgot. You forgot what I did for you. You forgot the blessing. You forgot the covenants. You forgot what I did in Egypt. You forgot what I did with King David. You forgot what I did with King Saul. You forgot. And when we forget, we lose our identity. And that's a major, major problem, okay? So as Israel is growing, right, they're obviously under extreme bondage, right, during this time. Extreme bondage. And I think that the problem, if you look at the whole story, the problem is not getting Israel out of Egypt. That's not the problem. The problem is getting Egypt out of Israel. And what do I mean by that? They're 400 years steeped in pagan tradition, right? They've known nothing but Egyptian culture. And things were great for a while, right? Because Joseph was reigning, and I'm sure there was familial passing on, a little bit of nepotism going on, right? In those first maybe 100 years. But there's a great line in Exodus when it says, there was a Pharaoh who came to power that did not know Joseph. Now Israel has a problem, right? And I think that we have this problem too, that we can't, it's not that, you know, we need to get out of America. We need to get America out of us, right? This idea, like the land of the free, what does freedom mean? If we're looking at a biblical notion of freedom, God is very clear. God is one who liberates. That is the point of the Exodus. He sets you free, but he does not set you free to do whatever you want. He sets you free to worship, because from worship, we get our identity. And right now, you and I, we worship a lot of things, right? We have a lot of idols. Idolatry is going to be a huge problem for Israel. It's a huge problem for us. Materialism, overemphasis on money, power, and entitlement, selfishness, entertainment, all of these are idolatries, right? And as we go through this story, what I really want you to try to do is see yourself. See America as Egypt. Because I heard this great line. Either these stories are really, really old stories, or we have really, really old problems. That's the difference, how you see this book. Is this just a compilation of a bunch of old stories that they're kind of neat and they tell some cool things that God did? Or are they really teaching us? Because no matter how much technology we have, no matter how advanced we get as a species, we still have the same problems. You guys, when you look at Pharaoh, he's us. Pharaoh is us. Like, I think so many times, like when I teach on this or I talk about this, people are like, Pharaoh, how could you just give up? And I feel like the Lord is, on his throne, like, just give up. And we keep being obstinate. There's things we know we need to do that we're not doing. That is no different than Pharaoh. And although our cultures have changed, the human heart has not changed. Israel is addicted to Egypt idolatry. And God is going to take them out of this addiction and put them through a pretty serious detox. But it's not like this willy-nilly sort of thing. The plagues are very particular. Okay? God is not some random God. And you will never outsmart him. Okay? He is going to outsmart you. And he's going to do it in such a way that he's holding out to you things that he's trying not to hurt you. But if you have a hard heart like Pharaoh does, it's going to hurt you. And if you don't, you will see these things as great mercy. I think when we think about Pharaoh and God, we think about, I was just talking to a couple of kids up here earlier, like Pharaoh's the villain. Like God picked Pharaoh. Like, sorry, Pharaoh, you're the bad guy in this story. And I'm going to harden your heart, so you're not even going to be free to do anything. You're just going to suck it up and ruin life for everybody, right? And that's the 10 plagues. Instead of seeing this, maybe there's a different lens. Maybe we could look at this lens through God is trying not only to free his people, but he's trying to convert Pharaoh too. He's trying to save Pharaoh. And these are not plagues of suffering that are meant to make everybody suffer. They are plagues of mercy. Think how many times he doesn't change. God just keeps handing him these moments, these gifts of mercy. They're severe mercies, no doubt. But we all have those in our lives. But he keeps doing it. By the way, how big is Israel right now? Like in Exodus, how big are they? Anybody have a guess? Million? Yeah, I mean, we don't really know, but we guess, right, from the Exodus, like from the crossing of the Red Sea, about 600,000 men, right? So this is a big group of people. We don't know exactly how many there were, but we do know this. They were big enough to scare the Egyptians. And the Egyptians at this time are the world power. And if the world power is afraid of a group of people, there's not probably some thousands, even 100,000s. There's a lot of them. And during this time, they're building these massive cities, right? With these massive sculptures. Egypt is known for its just grandeur, right? They're so big. If you ever get to go to Egypt, like I had the opportunity when I was in seminary, and I got to go to Egypt, and like to see the pyramids, you guys, it is unbelievable. Like unbelievable how huge they are. The Sphinx, how huge that is. The monuments that they built, it was just massive. And they did it for a reason, to say, hey, we're the world power. right? Don't mess with us. So the Egyptians decide to limit the number of children Israel is having. Does that sound like, we're thinking ancient stories. They decide, maybe they came to Pharaoh and said, the climate, it's kind of bad right now. Like, it's getting a little hot in Egypt. We think there's too much CO2. So maybe we should just not have as many people breathing, right? Or whatever it is. It's the same problem, different time, right? It's the same thing China does, right? They have their limited child policy. And so Pharaoh orders the death of all the male children. This doesn't work out because the midwives won't do it. So Pharaoh then says, all right, throw them all into the sea or into the Nile and drown them, right? It's interesting to note here that Pharaoh is killing the firstborn sons of the Israelites. Is that like, something going on now? Okay. He's killing the firstborn sons of the Israelites, and this will come back to haunt him, right? And it's also very worthy to know that where are these children being slaughtered? In the Nile. What's going to happen in the plagues? The Nile will turn to blood, right? So it's not like God, again, like he's not just, let's just turn a river to blood. Like there's a reason he's doing it. And I think that in the midst of this, you have, Pharaoh killing all the firstborn. Eventually, in the 10th plague, the firstborn of the Egyptians are going to die too. God's leveling the playing field. Because I think sometimes when you get a lot of power, you think you're better than other people. You ever notice that with people who are famous? I think I told you this story one time, but I remember watching the news. And there was on the news, it was September 11th, and there was the plane that had, they took down before it hit the White House. I think it was in Pennsylvania. The newscaster, he said, oh my gosh, I just got news that plane went down and everybody on the plane died. And he looks at the camera and he said, there very well might have been some very important people on that plane. What? Like you mean everyone? Is that what you meant? No, what he meant is because it was a what's that called? A commuting flight, right? Between New York and, some other city. And so a lot of very important people like famous people took that flight. And so I think in these plagues, you're seeing God leveling the playing field saying, Egypt, you're no better. You're human, they're human. And you got to get that into your head, right? And I think he does that for a lot of us because our pride is our worst enemy, right? So the master will become the slave because all are equal before God. So, as we move into this, another interesting note is that Moses is placed in a basket, right? And then he's floated down the Nile. Does that sound like anything we've read before? This is Noah, right? Noah is the last chance at salvation for the human species, and he floats in the ark, in the flood. And then Moses is the last chance of salvation for the Israelite people, and he flows down the Nile River in his own little tiny ark, more or less, right? And then Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out, and she said, she draws him out of the water and says his name will be Moses, right? Moshe in Hebrew means to draw out. Now, there's a double meaning here. It's not just that he was drawn out of the Nile, although that is to be sure, but he's also, it's his vocation. What is he going to do? He's going to draw out the people of Israel, Egypt, out of bondage into a new life. So we catch up with him at 40 years old, roughly, okay? And his first major move, best idea he could come up with, kill a man, right? So he decides to kill a guy. Now, whenever I bring this up and I'm teaching, especially the high school kids or college kids, I say, you got to remember, he's a prince of Egypt, right? And it's not like the stupid cartoon, okay? That's what I always got to bring up. But there is some truth in that cartoon that, he's hanging out with Pharaoh's kids, and he gets to do what he wants, and he's a big dog because he's in Pharaoh's house. So he's entitled, he's rich, he's kind of, he's well off, he's impulsive, he's rash. I do what I want when I want. He's grown up that way. He's entitled. And he is in no way ready for spiritual leadership. We have seen this again and again and again. You remember Joseph? Joseph, this entitled kid who has all these dreams, telling his brothers they're going to worship him, right? He's no way ready for worship. He has to go through this series of circumstances that is going to make him into a leader. And he does it where a lot of these guys do it in the desert. God likes to work on people in the desert. That's an important thing to remember. Not that you need to go like south of town to the desert, right, to find God. But the point is what does the desert symbolize? It's a lack of distraction. There's nothing out there. You're alone. You know, and in that, when you don't have that distraction, it's quiet and you can hear. Where do you not hear? In the city. Because there's too many distractions. I mean, the desert, there was a whole movement of Christians, you know this, right? The Desert Fathers. The Desert Fathers were like monks and priests and deacons and whatever. They all just went out to the desert to live, to encounter God. And so for years, Moses is out there, 40 years to be exact, and he eventually becomes a shepherd. I don't know what it is about shepherds, but God loves them shepherds, right? But he's taking, I hope you see what happened. He's taking a young, powerful, rich, arrogant man who is selfish, self-centered, and he's purifying him so that he can be the great leader and so that he can truly do what he's been called to do, and he has to do it for the next 40 years, right? So God appears in this burning bush. The burning bush is a fascinating image. You know, like anytime anybody's telling you that this is a made-up story by men or whatever, the burning bush is just like, who comes up with that? Like, if you're thinking about, like, you know, you're sitting around like, what should we make God look like? How about a bush that's on fire? Why not just fire? You know, they're like, I don't know. Why not something more grand than that? But remember, the fire is not consuming the bush. That's what gets Moses' attention. He's like, oh my gosh, that bush is on fire. Oh my gosh, it's not burning, right? That's weird. I better go check it out. And so the bush stands for the realm of creatures, the realm of creation, okay? When God comes close to you, you burn, but you're not consumed, right? God makes you radiant, but he doesn't destroy you. We are rendered more beautiful, more perfectly who we were created to be. That's what the saints are. You know, like John Paul II, I'm telling you, I met him like 5 times because I was greedy, right? But I met him 5 times, and every time I met him, I cried. Not because he said something so moving to me. I just cried. You got around them. I remember when my mom had a chance to meet him, and we were in the papal palace, and I was a seminarian over there, and she's like standing there, and she was so excited. She's like, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. She comes around the corner, he said, she's like, like just starts bawling, you know, in the pictures. She's got tears all over. And I'm like, everybody that got by him wept. Why? Well, because there was something about him. He was a conduit. God was living in him. And when you get around those people, they're just like, there's something special about them. You want to be around them. That's what the fire burning with the bush, but not consuming it. That's part of the revelation. But there's more, okay? In this theophany, you have 2 things that are subsisting together. Fire and wood. Okay, and I don't know if you know this, but when fire meets wood, wood always loses, right? But not here. Why? Well, because you have the created order, which is the bush, and then you have the supernatural order, which is the fire. And how can I say that that's supernatural? Well, because it's not burning the bush. Created normal fire burns wood. This is not burning the wood. It is some other type of fire. So in the bush, stay with me, this is huge. In the bush, we have 2 realities that are coexisting. Supernatural and natural. Human, created, divine, existing in one thing. Are you with me? This is the revelation of Jesus in the hypostatic union, fully God, fully man. It's 3,000 years before him. And he has this image of what's going to come, in which humanity and divinity will come together in the one person of Jesus Christ. It's fascinating. And then he calls Moses by name. And Moses sits back and he's like, well, I'm not sure he sits back, but I think he sits back and he's like, well, who is this? Right? Because he's not like, it's not foreign to him to have a God speak to him. Egypt is loaded with gods, and all of them spoke to different people. He's like, but this one knows my name. So this must be a God of the Hebrews, not of the Egyptians, because I'm Hebrew by origin. And remember, he's a pagan still. And so as he advances forward, this is important. God calls us by name, right? He calls all of us by name. And as he gets close enough, God says, stop. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals. You're like, well, that's kind of weird. I mean, we think it's normal now because we take off our shoes, when we're in something sacred or whatever. Like at the Good Friday service, before I venerate the cross, if you watch, this is really cool. I take my shoes off, right? It's symbolic of this. I'm approaching the divine, right? But the reason why God has him take his sandals off is to show that he's not in control. Because when you have sandals, I don't know if you know this, but when you're in the desert, you need sandals. Like, you really need them. There's like, and the desert that he's in is not like just a sand dunes. It is wild. It is jagged rocks. It is sand. It's terrible. When we went through the Sinai Peninsula, it was awful. It's an awful place. And so he takes off his shoes. Now he can't go anywhere. God's got him. Right? He's like, you're going to see that I'm in control, not you. And so he makes Moses very vulnerable. So he's making it clear to him who's in charge. And so as Moses comes closer, he wants to know God's name. And so he's like, what's your name? If I'm going to these people, I got to tell them what your name is. Because Moses still doesn't realize who he's talking to. And so a name is important. And so when we get what's called the tetragrammaton, it's a great word. The tetragrammaton is YHWH, okay? It just means 4 letters. Tetragrammaton just means 4 letters, which is Yahweh, right? And that is, I am who I am. Or, as a buddy of mine said, he said you could translate it, the is who is ising. That's my favorite. The Iser, the great Iser, the Wizard of Iz, right? So God replies not with a name, but an idea of who he is. He's not just another, you're not going to give me a name because I'm not one amongst many. I am being itself, Moses. Everything that exists in and through me. And then Moses realizes how incredible this is. This is something wildly different from what he's used to. And so he's learning that God is just not another spiritual being. He's everything. And you and I need to understand this. I think a lot of people, when we refer to God as this being, this great being way up there. Who's like watching over us. Like that song, God is watching you, God is watching you from a distance. Right? That's what we feel like he's way up there. That's not what God, St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian in the Catholic Church, never referred to God as the highest being. He referred to him as being itself. He's here, now, here, in you, outside, everywhere, all time and space. That is a wild concept to think of. And it is so foreign to the ancient Near East. So foreign that there's one God, number one, and number two, he's everything, like everything. So God is making it very clear to Moses. One last thing about his name. I think I mentioned this in a homily before, so some of you might remember this, but I found it fascinating. Right? He says, I am who I am. I'm everything, right? And that's like saying, I was, I am, I will be. Yesterday, today, forever, right? And in the book of Revelation, it says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I'm everything. So stick with me here, because the first letter in the Greek alphabet is Alpha, and the last letter is Omega, right? But in the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter is Aleph, and the last letter is Tav. Okay, so the beginning and the end is Aleph and Tav. The middle, the direct middle of the Hebrew alphabet is Mem. So the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's God, right? Aleph, Mem, Tav. Makes a word. Emet. And you know what emet means? Truth. What? That's amazing. I mean, I don't know if that's like what God planned, but, he can do anything. I mean, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm everything. I am who I am, right? It's incredible. So, and here's the other cool part, right? Let's finish that statement. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Holy cow. What are we talking about right now? God is going to set some people free because he is the truth, he is the way and the life, and he is who he says he is, right? God's plans are so wild, man. So, and then it gets even wilder. So Moses is like, cool. Like, I know the God of gods. This is awesome. And then God's like, okay, I want you to go to Pharaoh. He's like, whoa. I don't know. I don't know if you know this, but I'm not on very good, this is a paraphrase. I'm not on very good terms with the Pharaoh. And he's like, yeah, don't worry, I'll be with you. Oh, okay. We don't get this into our heads enough. How crazy that thing would have been. And I think that, Moses makes the same excuses that we make. I'm not smart enough. I'm not holy enough. I'm not powerful enough. I don't have looks. I don't have the money, whatever. There's always a reason why I'm not the guy that should do it. I'm not the girl that should do it. But God, he's just like, he doesn't even listen to Moses. He just says, I'll be with you. Just go. So the next time you and I are faced with something difficult and it seems like you don't have what it takes, this is a promise. This is a biblical promise. I am with you. Jesus says it. The end of Matthew's gospel. Behold, I am with you until the end of the age. Go out, baptize all nations. Don't be afraid. And then this is the best part. I love this part. He gives Moses a sign. Okay? And it's a funny sign. He says, this will be your sign, Moses, that all of this that I'm saying is true. Here's your sign. When I have brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you will come back to this mountain, and you will worship me. That's your sign. Now, if you ask me, that's not a very good sign. Because Moses is like, well, what's the sign this is all going to work? God's like, oh, when you get done with all of it and come back here, you'll know it was real. What? But he goes. And he goes with the most ridiculous request possible to the king of Egypt. Now, I want you to recognize something, okay? Did you realize, what did God originally ask Pharaoh for? That's it. Let my people go for 3 days and worship in the desert. That was it. There were no plagues. There was no nothing. There was no like, I'm going to take them out of Egypt. It was 3 days. Let them go 3 days. But he doesn't. And something that we buy, I think we really buy into this in the modern day and age, is that somehow the ancients were dumber than we were. That they were lesser than we were. That they weren't as smart as we were. And it'd be awesome if that was true, but it's just not. Now, we definitely have better medicine, better modes of transportations. We can fly, but the real root issue in the heart of man continues to be the root issue in the heart of man, right? And the root issue in the heart of Pharaoh is very clear, right? Pharaoh in the book of Exodus is a very modern man. Another way to look at it, as I've said, is we are very ancient people. And what do I mean by he's a modern man? In order to understand this whole story of the plagues, we need to understand the question that Pharaoh asks, right? And his question is the question that is in the heart of every human being. Moses says, let my people go to worship 3 days in the desert. And Pharaoh has this question. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let you go? You could hear the arrogance in this man. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? That is a very modern question. There are young people asking that like crazy. Who is God that I should obey him? That I should follow his commandments? That I should live the way you're telling me to live? The culture's asking this question. Pharaoh lives in a pluralistic culture like us. Lots of different faiths, lots of different beliefs, lots of different philosophies. And so it's not offensive for Pharaoh that this Hebrew's coming forward and saying, hey, God's talking to me. Pharaoh's used to that. As I said, the God spoke. The problem with Pharaoh is that this God claims to have some type of authority over him. And you remember, Pharaoh is a god, right? We know that, right? Egypt saw Pharaoh as an actual god. So it's not a problem to believe in God unless God tells me how to live my life. And if there's one thing that we cannot tolerate, it is a God pending on our freedoms and our wants. I mean, this is Adam and Eve all over again. Sure, we believe in God, and God is awesome, and everybody should believe in God, so long as God doesn't tell me what I have to do. And you hear this a lot out in the culture. A lot of people are Christian, but they don't really follow Jesus, right? Most of us are pretty cool with God as long as he doesn't make us do things we don't want to. That's Pharaoh. That's you. We don't like the idea of the commandments. I found this poem. It's called Invictus by William Ernest Henley. I want you to listen to this line, because I think a lot of people prefer this line to the Ten Commandments. He says this: "It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments is the scroll. I am the master of my own fate. I am the captain of my soul." That's a pretty arrogant thing to say. This guy is not intimidated by any threat of punishment or judgment, and he believes he's in control of his own fate. And a lot of people believe that. The reality is, there is a ton of objective evidence that I am the master of nothing. Literally nothing, you know? This is an overestimation of who we are. It's nonsense. My classic example, I said, try having explosive diarrhea and tell me you're the master of your own fate. You're looking for a toilet. That's all you care about. It's ridiculous. So Pharaoh is us, and so God goes to war, right? And so who is the Lord that I should obey him? God says, all right, Pharaoh, I've tried. Remember, because he tries little stuff. You know, the staff turning into the snake, the hand, the diseased hand. There's all these little things. He's like, all right, so you're gonna make this tough. God wanted it to be easy. He wants it to be easy for all of us. If you look, when the Israelites go into the promised land, the original plan of God was that they got to the promised land. They sent out the spies, right? And the spies come back. And what do they report? They're like, oh man, it's beautiful. It's flowing with milk and honey. But there's no way we can take it. And they're like, what? And he's like, oh yeah, there's giants there. The descendants of the Anakim, the Nephilim. We must have appeared as grasshoppers to them. I love that line. And Caleb and Joshua, my boy Joshua, he's like, we can do it. Let's go take it. And God's original plan, he says it. He says, I wanted to drive out the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, the Hivites, all of them. He said, I was going in front of you, and I was going to drive them out before you. They weren't even probably going to have to fight. And they saw all the plagues, and they saw the departing of the Red Sea. And they still said no. They made it hard on themselves. We make it hard on ourselves. I am convinced that God wants this to be easy. He does. Not everything, but a lot of it. And so in doing this, God teaches Israel who they are. And it is clear that their identity comes through worship. That's the whole point of the freedom of the children of Israel, to go and worship. And in worship, they will learn who they are. So, as we get going, I want to take a look at something, because I know a lot of people probably have this question. It says that Pharaoh's heart is hardened, or God hardens Pharaoh's heart, right? And so we sit back and we're like, well, was Pharaoh even free in the midst of all this? And the context of this is absolutely huge. Pharaoh's heart is already hard. That's something to take into account right away. We can see that by the killing of innocent children, right? In his fear, he kills the innocent children. He refuses to believe the initial signs. And God's saying that I will confront him with truth and justice, but his heart is so hard, he can't accept it. So by saying I will harden his heart, he is saying that I'm going to give him all the chances in the world, but because of who he is, he won't accept them. God is doing everything in his power to soften the heart of Pharaoh because it's already so hard. Now, 10 times in the story it mentions that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and 10 times in the story it mentions that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. If you remember 10 is a symbol of completion, right? Like fulfillment. And so the Hebrew word is translated for hardened as kaved. Kaved actually means to make heavy, okay? And it had a very unique significance for Egyptians. The Egyptians, among the tombs and the temples, they had hieroglyphics, right, all over. They had paintings all over. And in there, they had this image, and it was of a man's heart. It was in a jar, and it was being weighed on a scale. And next, on the other side, was the god Mat, who is the god of truth and justice. And his thing that he puts in the scale is a feather. And so if your heart was heavier than the feather of truth and justice, you were condemned to the underworld. So this is in the Egyptian's mind, right? This idea. So in the Exodus story, Pharaoh's heart is being weighed against not some pagan god, but against the only God of truth and justice itself. Each time his heart is weighed, it grows heavier and heavier. He just won't follow the command of God. He will not submit. And again, this is us. We do this too. So God is not forcing Pharaoh to say no. He's presenting him with opportunities, but Pharaoh will not abide. This is not God's justice levied on Egypt. This is God's mercy. He's trying to save not only Israel, but the people of Egypt as well. And when God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, he is actually saying, I will give him the opportunity to choose truth and justice, but he won't choose it. The plagues are meant to change Pharaoh's heart, but they don't. In the first 5 plagues, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. From the 6th onward, it says that God hardens his heart. Right? And so the idea being is like, we shouldn't have this knee-jerk reaction of an eye for an eye, right? We should have this knee-jerk reaction of, this is God trying to be merciful. Even the plagues, you guys, if you watch how they happen, they get worse in severity. Not just for Pharaoh, but for the people of Israel, or for the people of Egypt. So pay attention as we go through these, and you will see that there's a progression in the plagues. All right, so what does Pharaoh do after this encounter? He's like, the Israelites are lazy. Make them work harder. This is really diabolic. He says, I'm not providing straw anymore, but I want to levy the same quota of bricks. And the Israelites are like, we can't do that. And he's like, quit being lazy, go work. Because Pharaoh knows something. Pharaoh doesn't want them to learn who they are or unite as a family because they are a huge nation. At this point, to keep them from worship and learning who they are, he puts them to work. Does that sound like America? Divide the family. How do you divide the family? Work harder. Make more money. American dream. Forget about your family. You got to provide. Well, how much do you got to provide? Because if you're always working, you won't have time to teach your children. And if you don't teach them, who's gonna? The world's gonna teach them. Their phones are gonna teach them. So keep the people focused on work, and they'll forget about who they are. That is the devil's game plan. Keep them busy. Keep them distracted. Never let them know who they really are. And if they don't know who they really are, they're going to fall for every trick that I have. And so God stretches forth his hand and works the 10 plagues to show Pharaoh and all of Egypt who he is. Okay? Just as the 10 commandments symbolize the fullness of the moral law, the 10 plagues represent the fullness of God's expression of judgment that is levied upon Egypt. Now, in Exodus 7, he says, by this you will know that I am the Lord. So he's answering Pharaoh's question. Who's the Lord that I should obey him? By this, Pharaoh, you will know who I am, right? And so the first thing to know about the plagues is the Nile was everything. It was everything to Egypt. As goes the Nile, so goes Egypt. It was the reason Egypt was an economic power was because of the Nile basin. So turning the Nile to blood is symbolic of a lot of things. Number one, it's killing their power. Number two, it's the goddess of the Nile was named Happy, which is kind of funny because like happy and our word happy, they're the same concept. I'll get to that in just a second, right? So he's showing his power over the false gods of Egypt, but also remember, the blood is a reminder of the babies who were sacrificed in the Nile. And the blood of the children now flows in the Nile as a witness to Pharaoh's unjust heart. So God isn't, again, I said everything that he does in these plagues is very particular, very particular. So the reason the Nile turns to blood is to be a reminder to Pharaoh. Remember what you did. It's not just to make the water undrinkable and kill their fish. It's because he was trying to remind Pharaoh, I saw what you did. I was there. I'm the God of gods. And now you're going to see the blood that you spilt will be in your river. Right? So every human being, I think, the idea of happy, this God, it was all about flourishing and power, this goddess. And so every human being, there's this base human impulse that we want the good life, right? We want the happy life. This is our culture. Everyone in commercials is having a good time, right? Everyone on social media. What are they showing you? They're not showing you, well, some of them are showing you the cooking dinner. But mostly what they're showing you is their highlight reel. Look at how great my life is. Look at what country I'm in. Look at what beach I'm at. Look at this, look at that, look at this. You're just seeing a highlight reel. You're not seeing their lives. Their lives are a gong show, I guarantee it. Everybody's life is messed up. I think I've said that we call her my aunt. She's my second cousin. In her cabin, her lake cabin, she always let us use it for our vacations. And she has this sign above the lake cabin. Before you walk out of the house, it says, just remember, as far as everybody knows, we're a normal family. That is so true. None of you, you're all messed up. I don't care what face you put on, you're all messed up. Or if you're not, somebody in your family is, right? So that's what we think flourishing is, though, is having a good time. We think party, we think the secular man. That's Egypt. Happy that Goddess offers all that, but it's a lie. And we know this. We know it's a lie. Because we can have a life of money and passion, and the fulfillment of our passions, but it won't fulfill us. So we think that if we get enough money and we get married, we're going to have a good time, we're going to go on vacations, and I'm going to be happy. But we're still us with our problems. Tom Brady, I like to talk about him a lot. And he had this thing where they interviewed him, and they were like, what's it like? You're the quarterback of quarterbacks. You're the man. You're the best football player in the world. And he's like, it's good, but I didn't think it came with all the baggage. And they're like, what do you mean, Tom? You got everything. You got jets. You got homes. He had a Victoria's supermodel for a wife. And he's like, me? I look at all this and I think, people are like, Tom, you should be happy. But me, I'm like, God, there's got to be more than this. And they're like, well, what is it, Tom? And he's like, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. This is a man that has everything the American dream can provide, and he is not happy. The goddess happy is a lie, and we know it, right? When real life happens, it's not what we expected. It's actually really different than what we expected. You're like, I didn't see this aspect of crazy in this person when we were dating. Now we're married, and I do. I thought this house, this car, this woman would satisfy me, but it's not. And what has happened is we've trusted in something that we thought would bring us the fullness of life that can't bring us the fullness of life. And what is incredible about this is when it happens, people get mad at God. It's so bizarre. God, how could you let this happen to me? How could you get me into this marriage? How could you get me into, this debt? I don't know, quit buying stuff? Hello? So here's what's amazing to me. After Moses turns the Nile to blood, the magicians come up and they're like, oh, we can do it too. And you're like, oh, great, you're adding to the problem. So whatever water they had in that bucket is now blood. And what do? They don't submit. It says that they went and dug ditches and drank the muddy, gross water. They would rather not submit. They would rather drink this nasty water out of a ditch than submit to God. Drink sludge. I've seen people I've worked with, I got buddies, I got people I know, they just won't change. Their life is so terrible. I had a buddy one time, he came up, he's not from here, and he's like, he was on his third marriage, he was addicted to drugs, he was drinking all the time, and I was talking to him, he's like, I've been suicidal, and I'm like, did you ever think, maybe trying something different? He's like, oh, is this the God talk? I'm like, yeah. Yeah, it is, man, because your life sucks. So maybe we should try something different. He's like, no, I don't need that crap in my life. I don't need you and your rules. I'm like, all right, dude, then suffer. I don't know what else to say to him. It's so sad. So then God summons the frogs. I love the frogs. The frogs are like my favorite one. Exodus 8, right? I love the progression of this narrative. Just listen to what it says. It says, they are going to come into your house, then into your bedroom. They're going to get into your bed. They will be in your kitchen, in your bathtub, in your cabinets. They are going to be on you. So when we think about this, we're like, frogs? Well, that's just stupid. What kind of stupid plague is this? Well, we're not thinking through this enough. Number one, this is an attack on the Egyptian god Heket. Heket had a frog head, right? And so the frogs are not just God's like, ooh, frogs will be fun. It's because it's an Egyptian god. And these frogs, like, you got to, like, it's one thing to have frogs all over. I had a student I was teaching, and they said one time they were driving, it was at night, and they drove through this, like pond area, and they said all of a sudden, it was just like, bam, 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 and they looked, and it was at night, and there were frogs everywhere on the road, and they started fishtailing and, like, smearing frogs all over. Now, that's just one place of a road. Imagine what it would be like. There's so many of them, they're on you. I mean, like, think of like a foot of frogs in Bismarck, Mandan. Everywhere you go, there's frogs. It's an absolute mess. And so this god, Heket, was to bring about fruitfulness. If you wanted to succeed and be fruitful, you went to Heket. Okay? And this too is a lie. And we see this in the plague. What happens to all the frogs? They don't go back to the Nile. They die. Now, I want you to imagine Bismarck, Mandan, a foot deep in frogs that are dead. I mean, the stench. You're like shoveling. They don't have snow blowers for frogs. Like, maybe like big payloaders or something. Shoveling huge amounts of, like, dirty, rotten frogs are everywhere. Imagine the mess this was. And so the only fruit that we can bear in our lives is fruit born out of complete obedience and surrender to the true and living God. That's all that God's trying to show Pharaoh. And the Bible presses this truth ruthlessly. And the other reason this is a lie is because we all die. Our fruit will eventually rot. Right? We can't keep it fresh forever. Just like the frogs. The frogs last for a little bit of time and they die. And that's why Mark 8:36. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul? The only eternal thing that's going to last in you is not what you do, not what all these things that are around you, not the successes of your life, your money, your honor, your fame. That's all going to die away when you die. What will last is the love. I do a lot of funerals. And every time I speak, people are like, just talk about how much they loved. Talk about how good they were. Even if they weren't good. Yeah, good luck with that. You want my job? Nobody says like, hey, you know, my grandpa was a meth dealer. I was wondering if you could mention that in your homily. You know? My dad was an adulterer. Could you mention that? You know, like, it's always like, find the good. That's what echoes into eternity is the good. In verse 11, it says that Pharaoh saw, like the frogs die, there was a respite, a break. And it says, and he became obstinate again. And man, does this happen to us, right? What actually wakes people up to their need up for God is usually a tragedy, a difficulty, suffering, hardships. It's what we call severe mercy from God. He's trying to rein you in before you get too lost. And when the illusion of control evaporates, people see their need for God. Jesus, help me. I don't know what to do. And then when they get through the thing, when there's a break in the pain, when there's a remission of the cancer, back to my old life. We all do this. And that's exactly what Pharaoh does. Right? I mean, I learned a new way to communicate with my child who was on drugs. I doubled my spinach intake. I'm healthy. You know, and all of a sudden, like, we start losing the perception. I'm convinced that's why God left suffering. It's the last hook. It's the last hook that brings us back to, I've said this before, but do you know that since the year 2000, the number one day that we had the highest mass attendance in America, you know what it was?
September 12th, after the terrorist attacks. Why? Because there's nothing we could do. Downtown New York looked like an apocalyptic scene. These massive buildings were shattered. People were dead. Planes had blown up. There's dust everywhere, rubble everywhere, and nobody could do anything. And so what does humanity do in that moment? Boom. Turn to the one who can. And that happens when we get sick. That happens when we lose our jobs, whatever. It's that whole you forgot. You forgot what I've done for you. And so the frogs are dead. They get that all cleaned up, and then God calls forth gnats. And this is a funny plague, too, because you're like, gnats? Gnats. Why gnats? And there's a bit of humor here. Remember what I said in the beginning? Egypt is this gargantuan, right? Everything in Egypt is huge because we're the world power, right? And what takes them down? Gnats? Gnats. Like these little tiny bugs. I don't know. These are like the smallest of insects. And again, I mean, it's not like just like this, like, oh, God, knock it off. Like, I mean, imagine these things in your ears, in your nose, breathe. You can't breathe. They're crawling. I remember I was at Bully Pulpit one time and I was golfing. Don't ever wear white at Bully Pulpit, okay? I had a white shirt on and these gnats, they were everywhere. They were crawling. White was just the attractive color, I guess. None of the other guys had them. They were just everywhere, and then they get into your it was maddening. Maddening. And so again, we see this, right? And he tells Moses, take the dust of the earth, right? That's really important. He says, throw it, and all the dust of the earth will become these gnats. Well, the God of the earth is Jeb, right? And so Jeb, it's another assault on Egypt's pride to live in comfort and ease. See, the imagery of the Egyptians that you see, like in history, it's always like half-naked women laying on tigers, eating grapes and being fanned by these big. Like, Egypt was known for its comfort and its ease because it was so powerful. Think about us, the most powerful nation in the world. We provide comfort and ease. And there's nothing that can destroy a good cookout like gnats, man. Hate gnats. They're horrible. It's straight from the devil, right? God is revealing to Egypt, no amount of money can bring comfort to your soul. The world is too transitory. It shifts too much. Don't place your hope in it. Only the creator of your soul can truly comfort your soul. And so, I don't know about you, but this just sounds like America. I mean, we have memory foam beds. We have space-age pillows. And yet we're the most sleepless we've ever been. We're far more stressed. We're more anxious. Nobody's happy. For all the comfort and ease that we experience in this country, we are a people that are unsettled, man. And we're always complaining about what we don't have. And so the gnats are exposing the impossibility of man to comfort the deepest part of themselves, right? No amount of vacationing, money, and stuff will bring comfort to a hungry soul. Madonna, I read this quote from Madonna. She once said this. And all of my will has always been to conquer some horrible feeling of inadequacy. I'm always struggling with that fear. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being. Then I get on another stage and think I'm mediocre or uninteresting. And I find a way to get myself out of that again and again. My drive in life is from this horrible fear of being mediocre. And that's always pushing me and pushing me. You want to talk about a lack of peace? A lack of joy? Holy cow. It's important to notice, too, with the gnats, it's the first one the Egyptians can't replicate. Right? And why is that important? Well, there is power in the spiritual world other than God. Right? There is demonic power, but it has limits. And that's why it says, when they come forward, they say, Pharaoh, I think this is, and they use very specific words, I think this is the finger of God that's doing this. What's really cool also is in Deuteronomy 9:10, it says that the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God. In Luke 11:20, Jesus says, you say that I drive out demons by Beelzebul. But if I drive out demons by Beelzebul, then who do your own people drive them out by? But if I drive them out with the finger of God, the kingdom of God is among you. oh, they would have known exactly what he was talking about. That he was that finger in ancient Egypt. He was that finger that gave the 10 Commandments, and he's the finger that's driving out the demonic right now. Also, it's funny about the Nile turning to blood and the frogs is, as I said, the magicians can do these too. So there's all these frogs, and then Pharaoh's like, well, what should we do? And they're like, well, we can summon them too. And there's like, great. Now there's more frogs. This doesn't help my problem. The cool thing would have been if you could have made them go away, right? But they don't. So, but Pharaoh's still obstinate. And so God brings flies. A swarm of flies, right? It says, they will be on the ground you walk on. Keep in mind the gnats just left, okay? Now, flies everywhere. I hate flies. I don't know about you. When you're trying to eat at a picnic, oh my gosh. You're just like, and if people don't know what's going on, you must just look like a psychopath. You're like, but that's like a handful of flies. Imagine it says the ground you walk on is covered in them. They're in your ears, they're in your mouth, they're like these gnats, right? Again, this is a reminder that God demands complete surrender, no partial surrender, no temporary surrender. Now again, remember the plagues. Now these are bad, they suck, don't get me wrong, but they're not hurting anybody, right? Like they're not killing anybody yet. So God is saying, please, Pharaoh, we don't need to go any further. Please. But there's no partial surrender with God. Submission is the key. You are not God, he is. And something really interesting is we always think of Pharaoh and the Egyptians were crazy for thinking that Pharaoh was a god. But here's the thing, we do this all the time. I mean, I don't get up and say, I'm a god, worship me. But I think sometimes the way I act, I kind of think I'm my own God. I can do what I want, when I want, how I want. So, yeah, Pharaoh is on a stage, but I don't know, man. Like, but for the grace of God, go I. Give me a different upbringing. Make me a son of Pharaoh. Put me on a stage. Shave my head. Put a cool hat on my head. And I'd probably be like, look who's God. It's in us. I mean, think about Adam and Eve. What was the temptation? You will be like gods. It's not just Pharaoh, it's all of us. And he's not totally submitted. And no, sir, we're not either. And so more suffering is going to come. And so Pharaoh says, okay, hold on, time out. Here we go. Go ahead and sacrifice. Sacrifice to your God, but you got to do it here. Our animals. And Moses is like, no, not taking the counteroffer. But nonetheless, Moses goes and pleads with God to stop the flies, right? And the god Khepri has the head of a fly. So again, it's another attack on the false gods of Egypt. And what is really interesting from the 5th plague onward is that Israel is spared the rest of the plagues. I don't know if you guys caught that, but they go through, seemingly they go through the frogs and the flies and the gnats and the blood, but all of a sudden from the 5th plague onward, they don't get touched. It's like there's a hedge around them. Now, why? Is it because they're better than the Egyptians? No, not at all. I mean, if you look at it later, God says these are a stiff-necked people. He wants to wipe them out at Sinai. He's so angry with them. They're just as obstinate as Pharaoh. And yet God provides a hedge around them. Why? Because God's love and mercy can't be earned. It's freely given. Right? It's freely given. And in that free gift, he levels the playing field. Because Israel can't compete with Egypt. And so we Christians didn't work out our own salvation. It was freely given to us, just as it was freely given to Israel. And we can choose to receive it and live it out, or we can harden our hearts and turn away from God. And now, because Pharaoh wanted to mess with God, the next plague is going to attack the very thing he bargained with. Right? His animals. Remember what he said? You can sacrifice to your God, but use our animals, not yours. So God says, all right, then the animals are going to go. If that's what's blocking you, I got to take those out of the way now too, so then you'll let our people go. And so all the livestock of Egypt dies off. And this is important. It died off because it was all unfit for sacrifice. But all the Israel livestock lives. again, through the death of the livestock, God is showing the power over the false gods of Egypt. The goddess Hathor, right, has the head of a bull, right, a cow. And so that was, and her gift was love and protection, right? Love and protection. And the plague affected Egypt by creating an economic disaster. In areas of food, of transportation, military supplies, farming, economic goods were produced by cattle. God is trying to show how serious he is about to get with this whole thing if Pharaoh remains obstinate. I haven't touched you. I haven't touched the Egyptians. I've hit your animals now. Are we done? Can we just be done now, Pharaoh? Just stay down. But he remains obstinate. Here's a question for you. This popped into my head. How did Pharaoh have chariot horses to chase down the Israelites later on? Good. If he killed all the livestock in the field, then how did he have war horses? And it's an easy answer, okay? In Exodus 9:3, it says it killed all the livestock of the field, not the livestock of war, right? So the horses are seemingly, we would assume, protected, right? Because they're war horses, while the cattle are out in the field. So now the plagues begin to affect the Egyptians directly. And the severity of the judgment of God has now become personal, and it's actually felt by the people themselves. And I want you to think about this is how tyranny works. Through the obstinate will of a ruler, all begin to suffer. Think about communist Russia, right? You have a tyrant ruler, and he just punished the people. I'm watching a documentary on that right now, and people were afraid to go to bed because the next knock at the door, they could be dead. You were afraid to say anything because they would arrest you and shoot you in the back of the head. That's how tyranny works. And also, it doesn't affect Israel because they need the animals for the sacrifice, right? So they need their livestock. And so the next plague is absolutely one of my favorites because it has so much meaning into it. It says, "Go to Pharaoh and reach your hand into the kiln and grab the ashes and throw it into the air, and it will become boils on the Egyptians." Now, why is that so dang proper? Does anybody have any guess at this? I didn't know this. I thought this was so cool. So the answer is this, okay? What is a kiln used for? Firing pottery, okay? What did the Israelites have to make? Bricks. How do you take mud and straw and make them into a brick? In a kiln. What did Pharaoh take away from the Israelites? Straw. So the ash that is in there is the ash that's coming from the bricks that the Israelites made. So what Pharaoh levied on Israel to make them suffer even more is now going to turn on them. So the very thing that Pharaoh used is now going to be used against him. So it's almost like Moses is like, you remember this, don't you? I mean, this is how I would do it. Remember this, Pharaoh? Stop now. Right? I'd have some kind of mic to drop or something like that. And then all of a sudden there's boils, right? And it's that plague. Like Pharaoh should have picked that one up. Right? This isn't a LeBron James, you know. The point of this is there's meaning here. And that Pharaoh levied suffering on the Israelites, and so now that same pain is coming back to him, okay? And so Pharaoh has the children thrown into the Nile, and he hard presses the people in their hard work, and now this is all coming back to get him, right? And so I find this absolutely fascinating. Again, as I said, you're not going to outdo God. He's smarter than you, and he's cleverer than you are, right? So this is God, and this is also God's dominance over the goddess Isis. Isis was the god of medicine, right? So you kind of got a problem if you got boils you can't get rid of. And if you've ever had anything resembling a boil, I haven't, thank you, Jesus, but I have been to hospitals and I've seen it, and it is one of the most god-awful, painful things that you can, it's terrible, right? And so again, you have this suffering of the whole nation, but not Israel. And he still doesn't break. And so then he brings hail. Now, something I want you to really notice about this Do you see the progression that's going on in the plagues? It starts in the water. Where does Genesis start? In the water. And then out of the water comes frogs, which are amphibious, which means they're kind of both in the water and on the land. And then from the frogs, you move to the ground, right? He pulls the dust of the earth. So the earth now is turning on Pharaoh. And then it keeps moving up, and then it moves to the livestock. And the Egyptians, now it's up into the sky. It's the undoing of creation. Because God is going to undo all of this, and then when he leads them through the Red Sea, you have a brand new creation in the people of Israel. It's a fascinating thing. Now the hail is really cool. It says this in Exodus 9:24. It says, lightning constantly flashed through the hail. Okay? The Hebrew word is esh. Esh translates as fire, not lightning. Okay? So there is a separate word for lightning in Hebrew, which is barak, like Barack Obama, right? Esh is used one other time in Genesis 19:24. Genesis 19:24 is when fire rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? So this is not lightning. I don't know what this is, but the actual translation is there was fire flaming within the hail. I don't know what that means, but I do know this, that either, from a naturalist perspective, lightning started everything on fire during a hailstorm, or there was fire in the hail, and when the hail hit, it destroyed, and then the fire burned. Now, I tend to be of the fire in the hail, and I'll tell you why. Because remember, this is the undoing of creation. What two elements don't go together? Fire and water. Now, this is where it gets so super cool. Okay, one more thought on this. In Hebrews 12:29, it says, our God is an all-consuming fire, right? Beautiful line. I love that line. If we take that to understand God, then in the baptism of Jesus, we have fire immersed in water. How cool is that? You guys don't look that impressed. Our God is an all-consuming fire. We believe Jesus is God. God then goes into the waters of the Jordan, and you have fire in water, coexisting. Again, wild. And we're seeing the oppressive nature of the heavens. As the Nile goes, and then the land goes, and now the heavens are going. Everything is breaking down. It's breaking down the entire created order. It moves from the depths of the water, as it did in Genesis, all the way to the heights of the sky. And remember, Israel is guided by water and fire in the desert. You know that, right? The cloud by day and the fire by night. And the cloud is water vapor, so water and fire, right? And God reinstates the order of creation to serve the Israelites. Fire at night, water during the day. And then, if you can't see this, you're blind. Fire, water, confirmation, baptism. They go through the Red Sea, come out on the other side, and they're a new creation. Oh my gosh. And this was written by Jews, not Christians. It's freaking amazing. So, anyway, two things here show God's tremendous mercy about the hail. In verse 15, it says, I love God's line. He says, by now I should have struck you and your people with such pestilence that you would have vanished from the earth. So you can see God's holding back. And then he says, he gives them one more chance to repent. It's going to happen tomorrow, right? And then in verse 31 and 32, it says the crops that were destroyed were the flax and the barley. Why is that really important? Flax was used for clothing. Barley was used for alcohol. So what's God destroyed? Their comforts. They still have their food, right? And so God didn't destroy any of the food crops. So life is becoming increasingly more uncomfortable for the Egyptians. And we see this in our lives. It becomes increasingly more uncomfortable until we finally submit. And God shows yet again his dominance over the false gods of Egypt. The goddess Nut was the goddess of the sky. And that God was supposed to protect them from anything coming from the sky, and he doesn't protect them. And Pharaoh's ready to let him go, and then he sees the plague ends, and he changes his mind again. You're just seeing it like, come on, dude. So then the locusts come. Second wave of destruction. Whatever's left, After the hail, now the locusts eat all of the food. So now Egypt is like, now we're in trouble. We lost our livestock. Now we lost all of our grains. By hitting their food supply, the Lord displayed the possibility now of imminent death. Either change your heart or you're going to die, which is what's coming, as we know, in the last plague. But even that's not enough for Pharaoh to have total surrender. And the best part is, well, not the best part. One of the things is that even Pharaoh's servants are turning on him now. In Exodus 10:7, they're like, Pharaoh, just let him go. like this sucks for all of us. You know that? We're all hurting really bad. Maybe you should just let him go. And he won't. Osiris, the god of the underworld, was credited with the growth of vegetation and crops. So what do you have? The locust destroying everything that God's supposed to protect. And then God turns off the lights. 3 days of darkness. This is the attack on the powerful God, the Egyptian god Ra, right? The god of the sun. And when we look back at this and we're like, 3 days of darkness, that's pretty bad, right? I mean, but what we don't think of is they didn't know it was going to be 3 days. Like it went pitch black. Like it says in there, it says the darkness was so dark you could feel it. I don't even know what that means. But I can't places that are super dark. Like I was in this cave one time and they had lights and the lights went out. And that's dark. Like you're like, and you're like, I'm like, Joe! And he's like, what? I'm like, where are you? He's like, don't move. And I'm like, why? He's like, we're in a cave. I'm like, okay, what are we gonna do? And I felt like what do you do? You can't see. And when the lights are out for long enough, you begin to lose perception. You begin to see things that aren't there. It says they can't move, they can't eat, they can't drink, they can't do anything. I mean, this is bad. This is a freaky plague, and they don't know that it's going to end after 3 days. I don't know if you know this, but in Italy is famous for their relics, right? They have all of these relics. Like, they have some crazy relics. And one of them that I always found hilarious, they wouldn't show it to anybody, but there was a church in Italy that claimed they had a vial of the darkness of Egypt. What, like, like what? I mean, like all I can think of is like a wall. You know, the Israelites are over here, and they're like, we'll sell it later. You know, like, I don't know what they're gonna do with it. I don't even know. And like, what happens if you open that? You know, like, dude, that's not a fun relic. Keep that hidden, right? And so there's this darkness that is the hysteria, the panic that would have come along with this. And darkness for the Egyptians was a sign of death. It was a sign of judgment. It was a sign of hopelessness, right? And that's what's coming, right? It's going to come absolutely hopeless. I want to ask you a quick question before we finish up with the last plague. How do you feel right now, like about Pharaoh? I mean, you don't have to answer this. It's just something to think about. Are you thinking like, you know, Pharaoh is going to get what he deserves? You know, or are you thinking there's a bit of fear and trepidation in your heart because sometimes you're hard-hearted like Pharaoh? Or do you have a sadness because you know what's coming? Or are you just like, please, God, let it stop? Or you just wish Pharaoh would have submitted a long time ago so he doesn't have to pay the ultimate price? All those are questions for you to think about. Pharaoh is a true tyrant, right? And tyrannical rulers within history, they don't care about anybody but themselves. They don't care about their people, and everybody's terrified of them. And because they're terrified of them, they lie to them all the time. And because they're lied to all the time, they're repulsed by their own people and see them as expendable. And so you're paranoid all the time because everybody's lying to you, and then you have contempt for all of them because they're lying to you. To rule as a tyrant is truly to be the king of hell. Truly to be the king of hell. And Pharaoh, as any tyrannical ruler, doesn't care about his people. The people are at his service. I mean, you can see this with Hitler. You can see it with Stalin. You can see it with any of them. Whereas we see in Moses the servant of God and the servant of his people. So Pharaoh's all about me. Moses is all about others and about God. So we see here that the biblical notion of freedom is not freedom from all constraints, which is the devil's definition. Freedom in the biblical sense is freedom for service and worship of the highest good. Real freedom is found in the proper ordering of goods and the proper subservience of things. Put God at the center, you have order. That's Moses. Put yourself at the center, you have Pharaoh, and everything falls apart. And so this final plague comes with very specific instructions for the Israelites to follow, or it will affect them as well, right? So Exodus 12:2 is symbolic of a new creation. It says, this month will stand at the head of your calendars. This is a new creation, what I'm going to do. This plague will be the end of Egypt and the new creation of Israel. And this final plague, with its very specific instructions, it says, take a lamb. And that should get our ears to perk up, right? First of all, because we're Christians and he's the Lamb of God, but also because what did Abraham say to Isaac? God will provide the lamb, right? So they have a lamb. They take it in there, keep it in their house from the 10th of the month of Nisan until the 14th. Nisan is the first month of the Jewish calendar. It usually falls somewhere between March and April on our calendar. And then at twilight, which is the Hebrew day, begins around 3 p.m., you sacrifice the lamb. If you can't start hearing things that are going on here, right? I mean, in one aspect, God has saved the worst for last, but God has also saved the best for last. Because this is not only going to stop Egypt from this absolute ridiculous tyrannical ruler, but it is going to teach the Israelites what is to come, right? And here's the thing, you know why you keep it for that long a period? You keep this little lamb in your house. So you get attached to it. And then you kill it. Because then it means something to you. It's not just a lamb from the flock. Now it's a pet. And the kids get attached to it, and then you have to kill it. That means you're really giving it. You're really offering some. And then it says, don't boil it. Why not boil it? Because that's what the Egyptians do. Roast it with all of its inner organs. Why? Why the requirement to roast the lamb, head, legs, internal organs, everything intact? Because of that. Not a bone of it will be broken. He will be totally intact. And the last thing they do is they bleed out the lamb, right? They slit the throat and bleed out the lamb. Again, we have the slit in the side. Bleed out the Son of God, gives the last of what he has. And the whole thing revolves around a meal. Remember what happened in the beginning? Pharaoh makes them work harder, so they what? They can't have the meal. They can't be a family. And we've lost this. For the Jews, the central place of communion and worship was the table. It was not the synagogue. They held the table in higher regard than they held the synagogue, but not us. We've lost the family meal. And that's demonic. Sounds strong, I know, but it's true. The table is a place of communion, and the Sabbath was a time of rest and reordering your life. And if you lose that, man, you lose order. More work, less family. It's an interesting quick point about the unleavened bread. Whenever you ask people why it was unleavened, is because why? They left in haste, right? And so they didn't have time for the yeast to leaven. There's another point there, though, right? It wasn't just the rapid departure. Bread was a central part of Egyptian culture, consumed by all levels of society and eaten at every meal. The Egyptians are credited with developing the first leavened bread around 3000 BC. So even that they can't take. Even that. Theirs to be so ripped apart from the Egyptian culture. Even leaven in their bread. The rejection of leaven is a rejection of all things Egyptian. And then they eat the bitter herbs, which is a reminder of their slavery, and blood marks the doorposts. The doorpost is the entrance to home, so the doorpost, the blood, right, on the entrance stops the angel of death from entering. This is my own thought. I don't know if it's true or not. I think the angel of death is not like some killing machine that God has that he periodically releases on the world. I think, God is holding back the devil at all times. The devil can only do what he's allowed to do. And I think that you see in this last plague, you see what happens when God lets him loose. And the only thing that stops him, where he can't enter, is blood. Blood on the entrance to the house. This is so Eucharistic, it's stupid. The entrance into our house is our mouth. And the blood of the Eucharistic sacrifice marks our mouth so the devil, the angel of death, can't take us over. And he gave the Egyptians more than enough evidence that he was the true God. And because they did not believe, he simply let the devil have his way. I don't know if that's true or not. But in the end, Pharaoh finally says, you know what? Get out. Get out and never come back. And they do. They never come back. And yet God has to constantly tell them, don't go back. They want Egypt. They want bondage. They want slavery. There's a whole nother level to this talk, but we are definitely out of time. And we didn't even get to the Red Sea. But I want to finish with this quote. I found it Dr. Jordan Peterson, one of my favorite speakers in the modern day and age, one of the smartest men, I think, right now living. He says this. He says, we are foolish because we say that the old religious propositions are primitive superstitions, when in fact they are the most brilliant insights into the fundamental structure of reality that has ever been offered to humanity. We established our society on those presuppositions. And look at it. It's not so bad. We gave wealth and plenty to billions of people around the world. We've been struggling uphill properly. And if we were wise and faithful and courageous and responsible, we could continue to spread that to everyone. We could eradicate poverty and bring about an abundance for everyone if we hoist the world on our individual shoulders and operate collectively in this harmonious manner and continue to struggle uphill toward the city of God. And that's the truth. It is not a superstition. It's not some primitive defense mechanism against death anxiety. It's not the opiate of the people. It's a call to divine responsibility. And to the degree that each of us act out in the confines of our own life, this truth, we tilt the world toward heaven and away from hell. You see what he's saying? These stories are not just some made-up thing. They are the fundamental grounding of civilization. And to the degree that we listen to them, that we follow them, that we believe them, and that we enact them in our lives, we tilt the world toward heaven. When we take this and throw it out, when we smash the 10 Commandments, when we get religion out of schools, when we don't teach it in the family, we tilt the world towards hell. And you can see it happening right now. And so the call tonight is to not have a hardened heart, to submit, to bring back the family meal, to learn these stories, to ingrain them in the confines. We would have a Christian society. But we don't. We harden our hearts and we say, yeah, I'm Catholic, but. Yeah, I'm Catholic, but. I don't agree with this. I don't agree with that. And when you have a bunch of people saying this, but that, but this, but that, we don't agree on anything. There's no objective morality, and we will definitely tilt the world towards hell. Obedience, you guys, obedience, 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 obedience. It is hammered so much in the Bible. And not half-assed obedience. The whole of obedience. It's the great lesson of the Exodus. To the degree that you trust God, you believe in God, you're obedient to God, is to the degree that you will be free. To the degree that you trust yourself and abide by your own life and your own principles is the degree that you will be a tyrant and in bondage forever. But you got to choose. All right. If you guys want to head out, feel free. I can stick around for a little bit. We almost made 8:30. That's pretty good. I'll just stand up here. If you want to come up and ask a question, ask a question. That's just